I used cardboard and other simple materials to make a miniature room that can be displayed on a table or a wall. I'm adding the final details, making a seafood stew, a bread knife, and some bread. I need to cover up the cardboard edges, so I'm using some pieces of flat trim with miter cuts at each corner. I'm using my miter shears to make all the cuts. At the top, I'm positioning the trim so it covers the ends of the crown molding. I'm assembling the frame on a flat surface using a combination of wood glue and tape. I'll leave that to dry and attach it to the room box later. I'm accessorizing the corner shelf I built in the last video. I was previously gluing all the items down, but I found this vintage miniature that's in poor shape. Since all these pieces were glued to this piece of furniture, it would be really hard to remove them and clean it up. So from now on, I'm using tacky wax to attach my miniatures. To help this little portrait stand on its own, I'm adding a wedge of foam behind it. I want to be able to remove this someday if necessary, so I'm attaching the piece of foam with hot glue. Since the frame is made of metal, it would be easy to scrape it off the back. This is the German folk art painted motif milk can I made previously. I'm attaching all of these items with tacky wax so they can be removed and reused in the future and cleaned up if this ever gets dusty. I got these glass jars from my local Dollar Tree. I'm using the corks on some vintage canisters. I'm painting this hot water bottle from a Crisembond kit so it looks more like the brass inspiration photo. I started with a base of yellow paint to make the metallic layers stand out. I made it look really old by rubbing on some brown paint and wiping most of it off. I used a couple beads and a straight pin to fill in some space on the top shelf. And added my favorite pie tin. I'm using a black marker and some hot glue to add a little bit of detail to a cheap mass-produced candle. The entire room box is centered around this plastic Crisembond stove. I previously sanded it to give it a matte finish, and now I'm using some enamel paint to paint all of the detail silver. I'm using Tester's enamel paint, which is oil-based. I'll leave a link in the description where you can find this kit. I mostly used the side of the bristles to paint all of the relief details. I'll be covering the stovetop with some food and accessories, but first I'm adding a finishing touch to the egg carton stone hearth. I customized this plastic coal scuttle from Crisembond in the last video, and now I'm adding a little bit more detail. I used to have a wood stove where I previously lived, and there was always a little bit of ash and coal around the bucket. I mixed some black and white chalk pastels and used some of the foam coal included in the kit. When I first started planning this project, I always imagined some homemade baked bread sitting on top of the stove. I'm trying a technique where you use water and baking powder to make your polymer clay dough rise. It does all of its rising before you bake it, and when you slice the bread, it ends up having holes like realistic bread. I want a rustic looking round loaf, so I'm shaping it on a metal blade. Adding texture to miniature food is a really easy step, and it goes a long way in making it look more realistic. I'm using my X-Acto knife to cut little lines around the bread to make it look like the dough stretched and cracked as it baked. When it came out of the oven, I was so excited to see the texture inside, I started slicing it before I had even colored the dough. I could tell by the dryness of the dough and the tight crumb structure that I had done the technique wrong. When you're making miniatures from scratch, you'll often make mistakes and things won't turn out the way you'd like. Making mistakes is an unavoidable part of the creative process. Instead of chucking my little bread across the room, I decided to add some color and see if I could save it. I'm coloring the bread with chalk pastel mixed with water, which is just paint pigment, so if you don't have chalk pastels, you can use watered down paint. I'm happy with the color, but I would like to improve the texture, so I'm using a little pokey dental tool to try to poke some holes into it. The dough was really tough, so instead I just started scraping away at the surface, and I really like the texture I end up with. I linked a video in the description from Simply Stella showing the correct way to use the baking powder technique. I think this looks really great as it is, but I'm doing one more very simple step which really takes it over the top for me. I'm using some white acrylic paint to fake the look of flour on the outside of the bread and around the bottom. Since I cut my slices before doing all the coloring, I'm adding a bit of flour to those pieces as well. I'm displaying the loaf of bread on a simple cutting board on top of the stove. I sanded all the harsh 90-degree edges before staining with antique wax from Waverly. This product seems really similar to acrylic paint to me, so I'm not really sure why it's called wax. While it's still wet, I remove the excess. I'm making a stew for the top of the stove, so I'm adding a bit of watered down orange paint to make it look like someone was cutting up carrots before using this for bread. I used a stiff bristled brush to pounce some paint onto the cutting board to make it look like flour that came off of the bread. I tried to add a little bit of texture to the slice of bread, but since I had done something wrong, the clay was too crumbly and I had to glue this back together. I'm using some of the same baked clay to make some crumbs. Now I'm making a bread knife to display with the bread. I cut this little bit of serrated metal off an aluminum foil box I'm currently using, so hopefully it still works. I pilfered this piece of metal because I want the serrated teeth for the blade of my knife. I angled the end and cut out a strip. I cut the handle end of the knife a bit thinner. I'm using a really thin piece of wood that's actually old dollhouse flooring to make the handle. If you don't have a piece of wood that's this thin, you can use a popsicle stick or coffee stir stick because you have to sand it anyway. Using super glue, I glued the two pieces on either side of the handle. I'm using a really cheap round file to add rounded indents where your fingers would fit. Knives usually have little metal grommets that are holding on the handle, so I'm making a couple holes. I'm filling the holes with these caviar beads, which are meant for nail decoration. I coated the entire piece with super glue and stuck the little beads inside of the holes. They were sticking up above the surface, so I sanded it flat. I used a couple mass-produced miniatures, some hot glue, and white chalk pastels to make a canister of flour. I'm making a super simple stew, starting with rolling out some orange clay for carrots. I'm using a variety of chalk pastels and a little log of dough to make some potatoes. Since these potatoes will be chopped up, they don't have to be potato-shaped. I baked the carrots and potatoes in the oven in folded aluminum foil so they wouldn't burn. I cut the potato logs into slices and then quartered the pieces. I used some pink and purple chalk pastels to color some unbaked white clay. I'm creating a layered look by cutting and stacking the pieces. I tore the layers of clay in half and rolled them thin. I'm slicing the thin clay into tiny cubes to make it look like little diced pieces of red onion. I baked the thin clay with my heat gun for about 30 seconds. After baking, it's really easy to recut the lines without crumbling the little pieces. I mixed some brown into the clay for the potatoes, and I don't really like the color, so I repeated the potato process using white clay instead. I'll use the white potatoes at the top of the stew and fill in the bottom with the brown ones. I'm using UV resin as the broth for my soup. I'm curing the first layer of resin using my UV light. This is the part of the stew that'll be visible, so now I'm adding some white potatoes and slices of carrots. I'm very intentionally adding the little pieces of red onion so they look random. For a bit of green, I'm adding some dried parsley. I collected some tiny mussels at the beach last year, and I'm spreading these around the top to make it look like seafood stew. I cured the mussels in place and then added another layer of resin. I wish I hadn't added the last layer of resin because it took away some of the depth and texture of the stew. Since only one mussel was sticking out of the resin layer, I decided to add a few more seashells to really sell the idea that it's seafood stew. Before I can set the stove in place, I'm quickly adding the frame. I used some hot glue to hold the frame in place now and some wood glue to hold it over time. The frame is perfectly flat, but my cardboard sides aren't, so I'm covering the small gap with some strips of cereal box. If you want to hide the corrugation of the cardboard, you can cover the entire side with cereal box instead of just adding strips. I held the corners down with tape while the glue dried and painted the entire box the most boring brown I own. The box can sit on a table, but I'm hanging mine as simply as possible. I poked a hole, filled it with hot glue, and added some string. I'm making sure the string won't be visible above the back when I hang it on 2 little nails.